Okay, this is session number 34, believe it or not, of Old Testament survey. We've been at this since when? The end of March. Just plugging our way through the survey of the Old Testament. We're all the way up to 1 Kings chapter 12. Now, for those who are maybe joining out of sequence, this course is organized around the history of Israel. So we're putting things like the Psalms and Proverbs into their probable historical location. I will be doing that also with the prophets of Israel. The prophets are generally divided up between the pre-exilic, the exilic, and the post-exilic prophets related to the exile of Israel in Babylon. And so all of this is a whole bunch of dates. For those in Italy and the Philippines who are studying this with me, I'm sorry I have to go through some dates. I realize that dates are not fun to memorize, and I don't expect you to. But I'm going to draw a chart here to give you an outline of the dates for Israel's history from where we are here in 1 Kings down to the end of Israel's history. So there's a bunch of dates, and it will give you an idea of the flow of the history. And the really important thing for our purposes is to generally understand the flow of the history. There's lots and lots of details, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details because they can be generalized, but there is an overall trajectory, if you will, that's worth knowing. That's what we're going to work on. Let me get my iPad, and we'll see if I can produce with the iPad. Come on now. Oh, heavens. Kill that. Share content. Whiteboard. Bingo. Here's a whiteboard. I should be showing up on the screen off to one side, which is just fine. The way things go, red will work fine for now. The conquest is around 1400 BC, and David begins his kingdom in 1010. Solomon, this is David, and Solomon begins his reign in 970. There's Solomon. Before David, of course, was Saul. Now this we call the United Monarchy. Okay, United Monarchy. When the whole nation of Israel, north and south, were all together under a single king, more or less. There was civil war, there were problems, but more or less they stayed together. At 930 BC, with the death of Solomon, we're going to see a split between the north and south. So I'm going to change colors here, and the north will be green, and they're going to go up, and the south will be blue, and they're going this direction. The north, 930 BC, is under the reign of entirely evil kings. They're going to go down to 722 BC, and that's the fall of the northern kingdom. Some other stuff is going to happen along the way. There are like 7 dynasties. Yeah, we'll look at some of them. The seven dynasties are not smooth. Most of the kings died unnatural deaths. The politics of Israel during this time was not gentle. And this northern kingdom tended to assassinate one another. It was not it's not a pretty picture. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. We'll look at Ahab for a while because he's kind of interesting, and we'll look at Omri because he's interesting. But some of the others we won't spend a lot of time with. The southern kingdom, the north, we're going to call Israel, and the capital will be Samaria. The southern kingdom, we're going to call Judah. And it's going to last a little longer. It goes down to the Babylonian captivity. Some key dates for the southern kingdom are going to be 701, and then 606, and 597, and 586. Those are 3 events for Jerusalem. And now, in 606, Nebuchadnezzar of the Assyrian or of the Babylonian Empire is going to take over Jerusalem. And he finally destroys Jerusalem in 586 BC. These 3 dates for the fall of Jerusalem are 3 successive sieges that become increasingly violent until the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. The 70 years of exile begins here in 606 BC. From 606 to 537 BC is the 70 years that Israel was in Babylon. All of the prophets fit into this chart of the northern and southern kingdoms between roughly 800 or so BC and the Babylonian captivity. This is where we find all of the prophets. They're all going to be doing their thing. Now, while all of this is going on, we need to understand that the big wide world is also doing its thing. And as Solomon was reigning, in the background, we find an empire called Assyria. The Assyrian Empire reigned in northern Mesopotamia and was gradually growing. By the time of the division of the kingdom here, Assyria was getting to be a fairly important northern power. By the early 800s BC, we see Assyrian kings of various sorts running up and down the coast, causing trouble for the people of Israel and other nations in the vicinity. So Assyria becomes important. Assyria is going to continue to be a major power all the way down to about 612 BC. 609, we see the actual destruction of the city of Nineveh. And the world will pass from Assyrian rule to Babylon. The Babylonians from 612 rule the ancient world. And Babylon is the destroyer of Jerusalem. First siege, second siege, and first siege, second siege, destruction. The Assyrians sent a king named Sennacherib, who laid siege to Jerusalem in 701. That tends to be a real important date. We're going to find that event both in the Kings and in the book of Isaiah. It's a major defeat for Assyria and a major victory for King Hezekiah. Anyway, these are some key dates. The division of the nation in 930 BC, the fall of the northern kingdom of 722, Sennacherib's invasion, and then finally the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. All of those dates matter. And if you don't happen to remember those, that's okay. If you're one of my Moody students tuning in at some time other than this date in the middle of August, those dates do matter. They end up being on a test. Okay, let me get rid of that. It has now disappeared in the electricity. Oh, heavens, how did that get in there? How do I get rid of? Gee, sometimes this is. Okay, now we'll look at the text of the Bible itself. We'll get to 1 Kings and beginning at chapter 12. And everything appears to be proceeding as I had intended. Okay, I'm going to, and the video is what it is supposed to be. Okay, and I don't know if it's showing up on my other thing or not.
Probably not.
Yes, it is. There I am. And that's what's coming up on on everybody else's screen. So, like I say, I love technology, except when it doesn't work. Okay, chapter 12 of 1 Kings continues the story after the death of Solomon. This last chapter of Solomon's life, chapter 11, lets us know all of the things that Solomon did wrong. He multiplied horses, wives, and riches. And kings weren't supposed to do that. Now, those were all the standard practices of ancient Near Eastern kings. Everybody married as many wives as they could manage because that demonstrated power and wealth and all kinds of diplomatic relationships. Everybody amassed as many horses as possible because that meant a chariot army. The horses made it possible to mount a huge army. And then, of course, the wealth speaks for itself. What king worth his salt doesn't have a storeroom full of gold and silver and whatnot? And God had earlier on told the kings not to do that. Solomon's sin was to do that anyway. And so the Lord raised up adversaries against Solomon. In other words, civil war, political opponents, and other kinds of opponents, so that there would be a military opposition in time. The most important is a character by the name of Jeroboam, who is an Ephraimite. He had been on Solomon's staff as some sort of functionary, but he rebelled against Solomon. And it says he lifted up his hand against the king. Now that could well mean that he attempted an armed coup. We're not really told, but he was a very able young man and had a lot of political skill. Ended up Jeroboam was forced into exile. When Solomon died, Jeroboam came back. And Jeroboam is going to try to have the policies of Solomon changed. Now, Solomon had a son whose name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam was not a wise man, was not even a good man, but he was the next king. It so often happens in a monarchy that the son of a king turns out not to be a very able ruler. And that is certainly the case here. Rehoboam turns out to be not wise at all. So Rehoboam went to Shechem. All Israel came to Shechem to make Rehoboam the king. And as soon as Jeroboam heard of it, he returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy." In other words, very high taxes, very extensive drafts. It was a very oppressive reign because Solomon wanted to build a huge economy to get rich and famous very quickly. And frankly, I don't consider that a very wise move on Solomon's part. Nevertheless, that's what Solomon did. So he said, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Therefore, now lighten the hard service and his heavy yoke, and we will serve you." And frankly, that's a good suggestion. That's an excellent idea. If generally speaking, unless a nation is under some kind of an emergency where heavy taxes and draft and whatnot are necessary for survival, these things have to back off. And people have to be allowed a certain amount of economic and social freedom, or the nation will go into a revolution. And that's exactly what happened here. That's just what is being described here. So Rehoboam said to Jeroboam and the rest of them, "Go away for 3 days, and when you come back, I will give you my answer." And so Rehoboam took counsel with the elders who had stood before Solomon. And the elders suggested that if you would be a servant to these people and serve them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. But again, this is very good advice. It is probably advice that these same men had been giving Solomon. Ease up, lower the taxes, lower the burdens, and you'll have more favor with the people. They'll serve you. This is true. A tyrant may get what he wants, but as soon as the people can, they will rebel against him. And this is, unfortunately, Solomon had turned into a tyrant by the end of his life. So the elder said, "This is what you should do." But Rehoboam wasn't sure he liked that advice. So he went to his young friends, the young men that he had grown up with. And these young men said in verse 10, "Thus shall you speak to the people who said, your father made our yoke heavy, but lighten it up. You shall say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. Now, therefore, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions." Well, that's not nice at all. Matter of fact, that's a really, really stupid policy. The elders who were advising Rehoboam clearly knew that if Rehoboam did a thing like this, there would be a revolution. That's what they told him. And the young men, who are not just because they're young, but because they haven't been properly taught, for some reason thought that this would be a good idea. And the elders who had lived through more than a few good and bad times knew that this would be a problem. Rehoboam went with the youngsters, and when he spoke to them again, He told him exactly what his buddies told him to say, and Jeroboam, beginning at verse 16, chapter 12. When all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." So this is the official declaration of independence. And the followers of Jeroboam will head north to Shechem first, and then to Tirzah, and then to Samaria. In your notes, I believe there's a triangular shaped set of roads there. This is in the north central hill country. Shechem is the ancient city. Tirzah had never been much more than a village, and it was briefly the capital of Israel because it faced to the east toward the Babylonian power. Samaria will become the great capital of Israel under Omri and Ahab. That's the high point of the northern kingdom. And Samaria, interestingly enough, is on the west side of the watershed. It faces toward, well, Greece and Rome. It faces toward the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean powers were beginning to stir by the time Omri and Ahab were building the northern economy. There was significant trade with the West, and that's what they were facing. So this location was both for diplomatic purposes and for trade purposes, for economic purposes. It was actually a pretty smart move. In the south, Rehoboam stayed in Jerusalem, of course. Rehoboam came back to Jerusalem. He assembled the house of Judah and chose 180,000 warriors. They fought against the house of Jeroboam. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. "Say to Rehoboam, to the house of Judah, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives. Every man return to his home. This thing is not from me." And strangely enough, Rehoboam saw the handwriting on the wall. The people, the leaders of the army, refused to follow him. And Rehoboam decided that the better part of valor was to go home. The last part of chapter 12, we see a famous description here of the building of temples for golden calves. We're told that Jeroboam was told by his advisors that the people are routinely going back to Jerusalem for their worship because that's where they've gone for the last 100 years. And Jeroboam decided that that's not a good thing. We need to break that. So I said, you folks stop going to Jerusalem. I will build you temples. And so he built temples in Bethel in the south, which is on the border of Benjamin, just north of Jerusalem, about 14 kilometers or so north of Jerusalem, and at Dan, which is way in the far north in the foothills of Mount Hermon. The photo you see in the background here is the steps leading up to Jeroboam's temple in Dan. We haven't found a temple in the south. We know that it should be at Bethel, but we are not sure where Bethel is. The traditional location of Bethel, which is called Baitin, is in Arabic, is a great big place, and it's a great big tell, and it would be wonderful if it was Bethel. but there's no golden calf temple there. And a golden calf temple, as you can see in this background, is a very big thing. It covers, in English measure, about an acre. It's about 75 by 75 meters. It's a great big thing. These are stone steps leading up to a big platform. In the back center of this platform is a great big altar for burnt offering. There was a holy place and a holy of holies. There was a laver for washing. There was an altar for incense. All of the same kinds of things that you would expect in a full-size temple, such as Solomon's temple, on a smaller scale, but still adequate and monumental. There's no criticizing the quality of the construction in Jeroboam's temple here, but this is certainly Jeroboam's temple, and there should be another one. He wanted two of them so that they would be convenient for people in both the north and the south, the central regions. They could go on the annual pilgrimages. But instead of a temple to the Lord, he sets up golden calves. The golden calves were a fertility symbol. We saw the golden calves in Egypt. And when the people came up out of Egypt at Mount Sinai, the great sin there on the mountain, at the foot of the mountain, as Moses was coming down with the first set of commandments, was the creation of a golden calf idol. So it's related to that. Jeroboam says to all Israel, to a big assembly, here are your temples, O Israel. You don't need to go to Jerusalem. And here are golden calves. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. So he's mixing things together, mixing and matching to try to save his political life. It's actually a fairly smart move, and it worked for several hundred years. It didn't last long, but these things rarely do. Anyway, Jeroboam sets up golden calves. Jeroboam was not a good man. He was a smart man, but smart men are not always good men, and Jeroboam was not. In chapter 13, we see that a man of God is going to confront Jeroboam, essentially saying, "You're wrong to do this thing. You're wrong to be an apostate. You're wrong to take Levites who are heretics to be priests in these temples. All of this is wrong." But it didn't work. In chapter 14, we see more prophecy against Jeroboam. Jeroboam's death is predicted, and we see the end of Jeroboam's life reported in chapter 14, beginning at verse 19. And this is an interesting line. Now, the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years. And he slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. So we have this is a standard formula that we'll see all the rest of the way through the Kings. All the rest of the acts of King so-and-so and everything that he did, his wars and what he built, are they not written of in this book, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? There are several ancient books that are mentioned here, and as I've mentioned before, the use of old primary source documents is one of the key characteristics of real history. The fact that we no longer have access to those books doesn't make them any less important as real primary source documents for the history of this time. The rest of the acts, they're written in a book. Jeroboam's reign was 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab reigned in his place. So we have a source with the name of the king, we have a length of reign, and we have the following king. And with that information, it should actually be possible to put together a sequence of all the kings of Israel and all the kings of Judah. The fact is, we've got problems with the dates for the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. It turns out that the kings of Israel used a different method of keeping track of the date than the kings of Judah. These are, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it, but it's a question of whether you begin counting with 0 or 1. It's like some people count their birthday, the day of their birth, when mom gives birth, as the first birthday. There they are, that's 1. And then a year later, they're considered to be 2. Okay, now we don't do that in America. I don't know, there are some places that do that. There are some kings, some nations like the Assyrians, for example, who count the first year of the king's reign as beginning with the first day and going until a standard date. So perhaps the first 3 months or 2 months are the first year. And it depends, it would change from year to year. Israel tended to use the Assyrian method. In Judah, the Egyptian method was used, where the actual anniversary of the beginning of the king's reign is the beginning of his reign, and a full year counts as 1 full year. I know that's not clear, but what I'm saying is that the North and the South used different methods, and it's a little hard to tell. There also seems to be some overlap between kings, so that a king might put his son on the throne as an understudy some years before he'd actually die. That's a wise move. That happens in Judah more often than in Israel, but we do see those overlaps. And sometimes the Bible is clear about that, other times it's not. So there are some problems with the kings of Israel, and anybody who's ever tried putting together a list of all the kings and getting all of the dates exactly right will recognize the problems. The good news is, and it's only good news for people who worry about these things, but the good news is that these problems have been solved. 100 years ago, there was a really good book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings that first worked out most of these problems. Modern scholars have rethought and corrected that book, and today we have good chronology, good numbers for all of the kings of both Israel and Judah. There are very few problems left. Hezekiah is one of the few really nasty problems, which is too bad because he's an important king. But it's not bad. Okay, so that's that little bit of just a little. We'll get a historical note like this at the end of the lives of many of the kings, not all of them, but many of them. So Rehoboam is going to continue to reign in Judah. Rehoboam was a son of Solomon. He reigned in Judah from 930. He was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord had chosen. So that's not bad. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, which would have been 925 BC, we're told that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. Okay, that's in chapter 14, verse 25. People sometimes ask me, whatever happened to the Ark of the Covenant? We know that David brought the Ark of the Covenant up to Jerusalem. And when Solomon built the temple, one of the important objects was clearly the Ark of the Covenant. There it was in the temple. And at this point, when Shishak came to Jerusalem, it clearly says that he carried away the treasures of the house of the Lord. That would include this gold-plated Ark of the Covenant with all of the golden cherubs and the rest of it. Clearly, that's what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Indiana Jones got part of this right in believing that the Ark of the Covenant went to Egypt. It did. Now, it didn't stay intact. I'm virtually certain that the Egyptians melted it down for the gold, did something else with it, perhaps made idols from it. I don't know. This tells me that by the time of Rehoboam, God was no longer protecting Jerusalem. The apostasy of Israel was already great enough that there was unlikely to be any protection from God. Okay, then we're told, verse 29 of chapter 14, as for the rest of the acts of Rehoboam, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war continually between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, but it was never much of anything. Okay. Yeah, Judah's apostasy. Here are some idols. Actually, 2 of them are liver flukes and 1 of them is an idol, but they're all idolatry remnants. These are idolatry items found in Israel, in the area that we call Judah. These are found in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And they indicate that the people of Judah during the time of the kings were in fact idolaters. These are some of their artifacts. As we get into chapter 15, we get some more kings of Judah. Abijam began to reign over Judah in the 18th year of King Jeroboam of the north, and Abijam, reigned for 3 years. His mother was Maacah, and he walked in all the sins of his father Rehoboam. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, so on and so forth. And so Abijam slept with his fathers, and they buried him. And Asa was the next king of Judah. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, Asa began to reign. He reigned for 41 years. And Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So after Solomon, Asa is the next good king of Israel. And he reigned from roughly 910, 913, 910, something like that. Let's see, from roughly 910 to roughly 870 or so, 869, something like that. A long reign, 41 years is a long time. It's interesting, it's 41 instead of 40. because Saul and David and Solomon are all traditionally given 40-year reigns. It seems like that would be a nice long reign. But Asa is said to have reigned for 41 years. That makes me suspect that this is, in fact, actual history. This is the real thing. Okay. He was righteous down to 869 BC. Israel, the northern kingdom, is going to have a string of bad kings. They had nothing but bad kings, so we don't need to say, oh, these guys were bad, these guys were good, let's look them up, because they don't matter that much. There are 4 of them in a row: Nadab, Baasha, Elah, and Zimri. And Nadab managed to reign for 2 years. He was killed by the next in line, Baasha, who managed to survive for 24 years until he was done away with by Elah. Elah managed to survive for 2 years until he was wiped out by a character by the name of Zimri, who reigned for, wait for it now, 1 week, which is a new record. This was in the year 885 BC. And poor old Zimri didn't last very long. He was done away with almost immediately. By the end of the middle of chapter 16, we've got Elah and Zimri and all of these guys, and the people of Israel were divided. This is 1621. And half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and the other half followed Omri. And this is a fascinating comment on the politics of the northern kingdom at this time of Israel's history. The people had just done away with Zimri. He was murdered by a character named Omri. We're going to see Omri here in just a moment. And Omri, having murdered the king, then ran for king. And Tibni and Omri were the 2 candidates for king. And the nation was evenly divided between the 2. And it turned out that the people who followed Omri were stronger than the people who followed Tibni, son of Ginath. The next line says, "So Tibni died." I suspect that wasn't his decision. The Bible is often a little reluctant to give any details. The people who followed Omri were stronger, and so Tibni died, and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 12 years, 6 years in Tirzah. He brought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver, fortified the hill, and called the name of that city Samaria. Now, Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did more evil than all who were before him. He walked in all the ways of Jeroboam, and in the sins that he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord. Now, the rest of the acts of Omri, and all that he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Okay, so we get 1 paragraph for Omri. He reigned in Israel in the north for 12 years, which is not a terribly long time. But what's interesting about Omri is that his name, unlike the names of the earlier kings of Israel, his name is well known in the ancient Near Eastern community. In the Mesopotamian records, like primarily Assyrian, Omri is thought of as the great king. He brought Israel from relative obscurity to a position of economic and military power. He fortified cities up and down the King's Highway. He extended the control, the military and economic control of Israel as far as the Euphrates River. For over 500 years after the time of Omri, the Mesopotamian power, which included Assyria, then Babylon, and finally Persia, referred to the northern kingdom as Omri land. This is crazy. And why doesn't the Bible tell us that Omri was such a powerful, famous, well-known, well-thought-of ruler by the rest of the pagan world? And the simple answer is that from God's point of view, Omri was of no particular significance. Okay, he was rich. Okay, he was famous. Okay, he was powerful. So what? That and 50 cents will get you a cheap cup of coffee. And Omri, having lived a powerful, rich, famous, but evil life, went to hell. And from God's point of view, he was of no particular importance. And so in verse 27, as for the other things that Omri did, if you happen to be some kind of a obsessed historian and you care about an evil schmuck like Omri, go read it in a book. They wrote it down someplace. And if it turns out to be important, somebody will make copies of that book and you can get it. As it happens, that book no longer exists. So that tells you something about Omri. Very, very important man who, from God's point of view, was a nothing. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Asa is still going strong, and still being a good guy. Asa in Judah was a stable, godly leader. We don't know a lot about Asa, but apparently he maintained a stable, relatively free, relatively prosperous society. In the ancient world, we don't hear a lot about Judah during these years. They were neither taken over by other countries, nor did they beat up on anybody else. They maintained. And Asa is a good guy in that way. This takes us on to the next king. Omri is the king. Samaria. This picture in the background, I need to emphasize. Those pillars are the pillars of the ivory palace of Samaria. You've heard about coming out of the ivory palaces. Well, this is an ivory paneled palace that belonged to the kings of Israel from the time of Omri. Omri and Ahab reigned in Samaria. And Samaria will continue to be the capital of Israel down to the end of that nation. Ahab is the son of Omri. And this turns out the Omri-Ahab reign includes 12 years for Omri and 22 for Ahab. So 34 years is the longest single dynasty in the northern kingdom. And this is the third dynasty of Israel. Ahab was a really bad guy. He did evil in the sight of the Lord more than anybody before him. and he married a wife who was the daughter of Ethbal, king of the Sidonians, by the name of Jezebel. And Jezebel has a notorious name to her. When we look historically, when we look linguistically at the passage, to do a little work on this, Ahab is a relatively weak man. He was a weak leader, had a hard time making decisions. Jezebel was the power behind the throne. Jezebel was a Phoenician, and unlike some of the Phoenicians that had gone before her and before Ethbal, the Phoenicians at this time were thoroughly pagan. Jezebel was a witch, a literal witch. She was a medium. She had a familiar spirit and could talk to the devil. Jezebel was a thoroughly evil character, really, really evil character. There's some details in the story of Jezebel and Ahab that make us think that Jezebel is every bit as bad as any of the stories tell. So, what did Ahab do? He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Okay, up until this point, Jeroboam had erected temples that looked very much like the temple in Jerusalem, and had set up golden calves to let's see here. I'm looking for a way to get the chat. Let's get the chats, and no chats. Okay, so I think I am still good. I never know. Okay. Instead of being satisfied with golden calf temples, Ahab set up high places for Baal. Now, Baal, Baal in the Semitic languages, is a word that means the Lord or the Master. Baal was one of the chief gods of the Canaanites. We've known about Baal all the way back to the beginning. The Canaanites were driven out of the promised land by Joshua and then by the judges, in large part as a punishment for their extremely evil fertility religion of Baal worship. Ahab brought that all back. Now, part of what we're seeing here is that the influence of Jezebel, but Ahab married Jezebel, at least in part, because he was looking for ways to re-emphasize the old popular pagan religion. A temple for Baal would have included also a temple for Asherah. Asherah is the female that goes with the male Baal. At the Baal temple, sacrifices were made to provide food for the feasting. At the temple of Asherah, prostitutes were hired for the party that went along with the food. And this is very common in the wide range of pagan idolatry religions in the ancient world. But Baal worship is a particularly evil thing. We have we've got a lot of documents from the Canaanite religion. We know what an evil thing this was. As we come out of chapter 16 into chapter 17, we're going to be introduced to the first character in a long series of prophets in Israel. Elijah begins the episode of the speaking and writing prophets. He's the next great prophet in the line that began with Moses. So we got Moses and Joshua. And Moses gave us the Ten Commandments. Joshua brought the people into the promised land. Both of them were capable of miracles. That was in the period between roughly 1500 and 1400 BC. The writing prophets, or the speaking prophets, are raised up by God with Elijah around 850 BC, give or take just a little bit. That's about the right time. So Elijah the Tishbite said to Ahab, 17:1. This is a fascinating statement. Elijah is not mentioned prior to this time. We have no introduction to him. I have no idea who he is, except that he is from Tishbe. He's a Tishbite. The word Tishbe in Hebrew means nowhere. So here is a guy who comes out of nowhere. Where did he live? Somewhere out in the wilderness. Nobody had ever heard of the place. It is somewhere in Gilead. Gilead is the tribe of Manasseh in the place today known as the Golan Heights. There were no big cities up there. And Elijah was somebody who came from there and was nobody. Ahab, on the other hand, was the king of Israel. He reigned in an ivory palace in Samaria over a land that had become respected by the entire ancient world. The Babylonian powers, the Assyrian powers, the up and coming Greek power, the whatever power there was left in Asia Minor. Ahab was the king of that nation. He certainly had security. There is no question there was a palace guard. And so how is it? How did it happen that Elijah walked in and spoke to Ahab? Years ago, Donna and I were invited by a former church member, one of the young men at our church, who had gone off to the Air Force and had entered a career in the Air Force and had ended up as a seconded member of the Air Force as an audio-visual engineer for the White House in Washington, D.C. He was under the president at the time, Bill Clinton. Donna and I were not particularly fond of President Clinton, but he was the president, and really, that's fine. We got an invitation to go back there while we were back visiting another son in the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And we stopped through in Washington and went to the White House. And I remember we didn't know what we were looking at or where we were. We knew that that was the White House. We went up to the gate and we pushed a button and the gate opened. We walked in and we found ourselves in a cage, both sides and overhead, with cameras pointing in several directions. And we weren't sure quite what to do, but we figured maybe we had gone in the wrong gate. We were supposed to be going to the old executive office building, and this looked like it wasn't going to get us there. And a disembodied voice said, "State your business." And so we said, we're trying to get to the old executive office building to meet an appointment. And they said, well, you're in the wrong place, get out. Apparently we had tried to get into the White House grounds and they weren't going to let us in there. It's actually very difficult to get into the White House. A few weeks ago, some rioters tried to get into the White House, and it started a big fight with rocks and bottles, and some people got hurt. It's not very pleasant. We finally got into the old executive office building. They cleared our paperwork and our IDs, and we went through all of that. Finally went through the Secret Service tunnel into the White House itself with our escort, and came up through the elevator out on the main floor of the White House. And our friend told us as we were coming out of the White House, the president isn't in the West Wing right now, but the Secret Service men who you'll see guarding the West Wing would prefer that you don't walk that direction. You should get out of the elevator and walk straight toward the front door. Don't make a turn toward the West Wing or they might have to stop you. That's the way it really is. In the real world, that's the way it really is. And when you go in to see a king or a president or a monarch of some kind, there is security. Ahab certainly had security. I've always wondered if perhaps Elijah did an old Jedi mind trick on Ahab. You know, this is not the prophet you're looking for. You serve your master well. He can speak to Ahab, that kind of a thing. I would like that, but I doubt that that's quite the way it worked. At any rate, Elijah the Tishbite came in and spoke to Ahab and said, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these next few years, except by my word." Okay, a drought. Ahab predicts a drought. Now, why does that make a difference? This is the first in a series of predictions or miraculous events that end up being an attack on the central tenets of the religion of Baal. Who was Baal? Well, Baal is the god of thunder and lightning. In the background of this photograph, behind that's the rental car I drove that year. I'm right at the summit of Mount Carmel in Israel. And this is where all of this happened. Those clouds that you see in the background are the beginnings of a thunderstorm. The worshippers of Baal believed that when they went through the rituals of Baal worship, when they sacrificed their bulls, when they sacrificed their wine, when they hired their prostitutes, they were encouraging Baal to come back to life and make the land fertile by sending thunder and lightning, rain. He's the god of rain. And in the ancient world, rain was the main event. Rain was very, very important. When there was no rain, which happens fairly regularly in the Near East, a famine is the result. So Elijah announces to Ahab, "O King Ahab, live forever. So you believe that you and your priests of Baal and Asherah can make it rain. Good, fine. I say there'll be no rain for the next years unless I say it rains. Now, do what you will." Now, we have historical evidence in the form of archaeology that Ahab went out and began building very deep water systems in the main cities of the northern kingdom. So Gezer, Megiddo, and another farther in the north, I believe Tel Dan, all have very deep, very expensive water systems to make sure that the main royal cities where the royal bureaucracy lived had adequate water for the famine. Dan, Hatzor is the other one. So Dan, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer all had elaborate water systems. built at, in today's money, enormous expense, gigantic tax expense. I've been in several of these water systems, and there still is a little bit of water in some of them. For the most part, the water is maybe a few centimeters deep, green, muddy, nasty, stinky water. And I've often thought, there it is, your tax dollars at work. Ahab was perfectly happy to spend a lot of tax money to make sure that people dependent on the government had everything they need. Well, after a while, Elijah decided that it would be safer to be elsewhere. He made himself scarce, went to a place called the brook Kerith, and we don't know where that is. And he drank from the brook for a while, and the ravens fed him. And I'm not sure I would want to eat anything that birds brought me, but that's what Elijah did. After a while, the brook dried up, and he went on to a place called Zarephath, where there was a widow with a son. And the widow of Zarephath fed him and cared for him throughout the rest of this time of famine. And as a result of that, she was blessed. This is a great story. Here's a widow in a time of famine, and nobody has enough to eat. Nobody has enough to drink. There's very little food, and yet God provided enough food for Elijah, for the widow, and her son. At the end of this time, the son actually died, and Elijah raises the widow's son back to life. That again is a picture of the difference between Baal and Yahweh. Baal was claimed to be resurrected every year. The Baal cycle is a cycle of death and resurrection. Some people say that Christians just stole the idea, they plagiarized the idea, but the similarities are almost none. No, we didn't plagiarize the story, we didn't steal it. Baal was brought back to life by the ministrations of the prostitutes. This is an utterly disgusting thing. The priests of Baal and the priests of Asherah claimed that they could bring Baal back from the dead. Elijah, as an act of the blessing of God, as an act of miracle, brought this boy back to life. This is a resuscitation, not a resurrection, but he brought the boy back to life and gave him to his mother. This is, again, a demonstration that the things claimed for Baal, which are not true, are in fact true of God. God is the one who sends the rain or withholds it. God is the one who gives life, and God alone. When we get back together next Monday, we're going to start in chapter 18 with the confrontation between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And I'm looking forward to that. It's one of my favorite sequences in the Old Testament. So we'll get ready for that. Let me see if I can make the share stop, and I would get the gallery up, and I will. Oh, come on, let's get everybody unmuted. Okay, now we're unmuted. We can start talking to everybody. Okay, that was fun.